say what organization you work for, and also your affiliation with Equal Justice.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Racial Justice Beyond Litigation, Working Outside the Legal System to Effect Change. The session will start shortly. Speakers will take questions near the end of the session, so if you would like to ask them anything, please type your questions into the chat box on the Pathable page. To access closed captioning during this session, you can press the closed caption button at the bottom of the video. You may have to hover your mouse over the video in order to see the button. If you have to leave the session early for any reason, a recording of the session will be available the following day for you to listen to. You can always access the recording by coming back to this page in Pathable. All right, hello everyone. Thank you again for attending the conference and career fair. We hope that you've had a positive experience so far. My name is Angelica Conway Simmons, and I'm the HR manager at Equal Justice Works. Today's session is titled Racial Justice Beyond Litigation, Working Outside the Legal System to Effect Change. If you'd like to enable closed captioning on your screen, please click the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists during the session, please type them into the Pathable chat feature. Our panelists will answer the questions at the end of the session. This session will run from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. If you have to leave during part of the session, you can always rejoin by clicking on the name of this session under the Event Agenda section. This session will be recorded, so if you are unable to rejoin, you will be able to listen to it at a later date. We are recording this session so that other attendees may also learn from our incredible experts. This recording will not be used for any other purposes. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and moderator, Jason Bailey, Anaya Robinson, Eliana Green, and Walter Jean-Jacques.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Looking forward to having a lively discussion on such pertinent issues, racial justice litigation and community work and how they intersect. Like Angelica stated, my name is Walter Jean-Jacques. Currently, I'm a Notre Dame Public Interest Law Fellow at the NAACP Legal Defense Educational Fund. Also, I'm a board member on Equal Justice Works Board of Directors and also a former National Advisory Committee member for Equal Justice Works. I think we can start off by Eliana, if you can introduce yourself, the current organization that you work for, and your affiliation with Equal Justice Works.
Thank you, Walter. Good morning, y'all. As Walter stated, my name is Eliana Green. I'm an Equal Justice Works fellow sponsored by Hewlett Packard Enterprise and Morgan Lewis and Bokius. I just started my second year of my fellowship with my host organization, Root and Rebound, whose mission is to restore power and resources to families and communities who are most harmed by mass incarceration. So we help folks navigate collateral consequences to having a criminal record by providing clients with direct legal services, public education, and systems changing work such as policy reform and litigation. And my project focuses on obtaining reparations for victims of the war on drugs through this three-pronged model. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you all this morning.
Thank you, Eliana. Anaya, if you can come and introduce yourself next. Thank you.
Sure. Good morning, y'all. My name is Anaya Robinson. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm an advocacy strategist with the ACLU of Louisiana. Before that, I was a racial justice fellow at the ACLU of Louisiana, and I produced a report about Louisiana's pretrial system. So as an advocacy strategist, I help develop advocacy campaigns, political engagement strategies. I do coalition building, cultural programming, and research, education, writing, and power building. But before that, I was the student chair of Equal Justice Works National Advisory Committee. And I actually still have the name tag from the Equal Justice Work Conference that I went to a couple years ago. And me and Eliana actually went to law school together. So this whole panel just feels like a very nice reunion. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, I went to undergrad together, coincidentally, so you run into the same people.
Yeah, it's a great big family.
And Jason, if you can end us up. Oh.
Sure. Thanks, Walter, and thanks everyone for allowing me to be a part of the conversation this morning. My name is Jason Bailey. I am Special Economic Justice Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I'm based in Washington, D.C. As part of my job, I litigate cases that fall within LDF's economic justice portfolio. So mostly things involving employment, housing, and environmental discrimination. Before I joined LDF, I was a trial attorney at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Some of the other panelists, I started my career as an Equal Justice Works fellow. I was a member of the 2015 class. I did my fellowship at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, also in DC. And my fellowship was basically fighting fair housing discrimination in my home state of Arkansas. So again, really happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Jason. And I'm truly excited to moderate this very important and pertinent session that we have, and with such an esteemed group of panelists. I guess we could start off with a question, I believe, which is very pertinent. As a recent law school graduate myself, I feel like this question is so important for people that are highly interested in doing the intersection between racial justice and community work. So this question, we're going to start off with Anaya. So how are both racial justice and community work connected? How do you see that, playing through with the work that you've done as a racial justice fellow and now in your current position?
Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about. I actually have a story to share about this. So I was actually an organizer before I went to law school. And the group I was working with, we were all young Black people, and we were planning a protest. And so we reached out to a local attorney just to understand if there were any relevant laws that we needed to know about. And, we literally just needed to know if there were any laws that impacted our plans. But instead, the lawyer actually used the opportunity to talk down to us and try and change our minds about what we had worked for months to plan. So that whole experience of interacting with this very patronizing lawyer who was white, that was the experience that motivated me to go to law school, because I just remember sitting there and thinking, my community deserves so much better than what we're getting right now. And so I share that story just to kind of show that first, there's usually already work happening in communities, right? So as an attorney who's interested in racial justice litigation and racial justice work, I think it's really important to start with the question of, what does the community need, and what has the community asked me as an attorney to contribute? Because the people who are closest to the pain, who have been pushed to the margins, Black communities and communities of color, most likely already know that there's a problem in their community. And chances are these folks, because of their pain, they know what they need in order to be better. So it's important for you as a lawyer to kind of center and respect their leadership. And I also share this story to kind of show what not to do. Because that lawyer didn't center our leadership and, kind of talk down to us instead of supporting us, that led to a breakdown of trust, and it harmed a community that was already facing so much oppression. So that's a very, very long way of saying that the communities that you're going to be supporting with your litigation and with your legal work, they chances are already know what they need. And as an attorney who is someone that's coming from a place of privilege because of your education, it's up to you to think about how to censor the community's leadership and kind of follow their lead.
Thank you. Any panelists, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree with your statement of, I think it's tremendously important to have impacted folks be at the center and in leadership in terms of how you're moving between community and litigation or other forms of the law. Similar to Anaya, I can think of one example of in California, where we're based out in Oakland, there's a large ban the box movement led by impacted folks who are formerly incarcerated or systems impacted. And that has expanded into the occupational licensing sphere. And so 1/4 of the jobs in California require an occupational license, and you have to get a background check a lot of times. So we've been able to join on to policy work that's been led by community to change those laws so that as of July of this year, occupational licensing boards are no longer able to disqualify for folks for having a conviction that has been expunged. And so it's been really cool to be at an organization that not only does policy work with direct services, because I've been able to be one of the first people to actually engage in litigation with these new laws, of having a client who had a past marijuana conviction that had since been expunged, and a occupational licensing board was trying to deny them, of their livelihood and ability to practice as a professional. So it's just been really cool to combine that policy advocacy that's, led by impacted folks, and then be able to help and use the law as a tool to enforce what community has already said is important.
Yeah, I would just echo what Anaya and Eliana said. I think it's really important to be community centered in whether it's policy advocacy or litigation. I think especially at larger public interest organizations, a lot of times the people that work there sometimes don't account for that, and they come into a place, they're working in DC, but they're going into rural Alabama or Arkansas or Louisiana or those places, and really trying to push their own agenda. But it's really important to just have an ear and an open mind to listen to what people actually in those communities want. And kind of as Anaya mentioned, I mean that's really the way to build trust and rapport with the community going through whatever advocacy that you're pushing. So I would just definitely echo those sentiments in that regard, and just remember that whatever your role is, to definitely always keep a community approach.
Thank you all so much. And just to add, I guess, a few things to that, I would say, especially during this time, it's truly important to keep communities, especially communities of color, and especially Black communities, aware of, how racial justice litigation impacts them. I feel like a lot of you touched upon how a lot of lawyers tend to talk down to people from the community, and it's very important to be grounded within the community so members of the community can understand how this court case impacts them on, on a day-to-day basis, on how they can address issues via litigation. And Jason, you also touched upon a tendency that a lot of major organizations tend to fall into the trope of, is that some people within the organization tend to forget how this work is grounded within the community, and how you need to be amongst members of the community. And now during this age of COVID-19, I know we have to find a nuanced way of interacting with members of the community to make sure that they're not being impacted, or being placed in harm. and also their livelihoods are being, jeopardized because of the conditions that we're in. So thank you all. I guess we can continue with the conversation by focusing on economic justice. I know a lot of you, your main area is like the intersection of racial justice and economic justice. And a lot of people, I tend to not be aware of how that intersects when it comes to racial justice litigation. Jason, could you expand upon that and how your current position at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, you utilize racial justice and economic justice?
Sure. Yeah, one of the primary reasons why I was really attracted to doing economic justice work was just because of how, economic justice touches every aspect of, life in this country, and especially Black life. And so, it just, especially in my practice, we do a lot of fair housing litigation work. And with fair housing, I mean, it's really an expansive statute, the Fair Housing Act, and we're just able to touch on policies that most people would not think about in terms of like traditional economic justice work. So, for example, one thing that became really prominent with the pandemic was access to water, and especially with the Black community and the Brown community and other communities of color that were disproportionately affected by COVID, access to water became a really pertinent issue. If you go look at different reports and statistics, you'll find that communities of color are often disproportionately affected by water shutoffs, and usually there are no like protections or very little relief in terms of arrears. So all of us know if you don't pay your water bill, most of the time you're going to get disconnected from your water service. And so while it was always a health issue before the pandemic, it was literally an issue of life and death at the pandemic. And so one thing that I'm really proud of that we're doing at LDF is that we recently filed a lawsuit against the city of Detroit. And we allege in part that Detroit's water shutoff policy violated the Fair Housing Act because if you look at statistics and where water shutoffs are occurring, most of the shutoffs are occurring in Black and Brown communities, even if you control for these people's income. And so that's just kind of just one aspect of how, economic justice really affects, it's really a cross-sectional issue and deals with racial justice in ways that most people wouldn't think about. And litigation can be a really effective tool at addressing these things. So it's important also to just kind of keep an open mind when it comes to these things, because I think that most people wouldn't even, consider a water shutoff policy to be in violation of the Fair Housing Act. And so, that's just one example of how racial justice litigation can affect economic justice.
Wow, thank you for sharing your work with us, Jason. That's really awesome that y'all are moving on that lawsuit. That's ridiculous. But I think that it's important to remember that racial justice is economic justice. We live in a capitalistic country that's built off the backs of slaves, where Black life was the first commodity that we had. And so it's directly equating to providing economic justice is racial justice. And I think that there's a lot of creative ways that all of our work meets that intersection. One way that my work meets that intersection is in providing reparations for the war on drugs, providing economic opportunities through the multi-billion-dollar cannabis industry that's out in California. Our project is based out in Oakland, California. So one way we're doing that is working with a marijuana company called Viola, who's actually Al Harrington's company, who's a former NBA player, and creating a Know Your Rights toolkit for folks with drug-related convictions. California has been over the last 10 years quickly shifting their drug laws, but laws are no good if people do not know how to access the benefits and the protections of those laws. So really trying to democratize the law in a way that is accessible and easy to understand how these laws apply to me and how they can benefit me. And then another way is also, doing consulting work with cannabis companies to teach them, one, how internally you recognize that you, as a cannabis industry, you are in an industry that was built off the backs and blood of Black people. And there needs to be correction for that harm before you make multi-billion dollars off of this. So one, philanthropically, how do you give outwardly and make sure that you're reinvesting in community and giving back that same energy that you're taking from community? And then two, a whole separate and equally important conversation is internally, how do you make sure that you have an equitable hiring practices? How do you make sure that you're not continuing to disproportionately harm the Black and brown folks who have already been harmed by the creation of this industry? So yeah, I think that those are a few ways that racial justice and economic justice are intertwining in my work.
Yeah, I mean, Eliana really kind of hit the nail on the head. I can say, as someone who was born and raised in Louisiana, we're a very economically poor state. Um, the median income in Louisiana is just $27,000, and 4% of Louisiana's white population is unemployed, but for Black people, that statistic actually doubles to 8%. And so that shows you that these two issues should not be siloed. And so, that connection between economic justice and racial justice, that has real effects for the Black people that live in Louisiana, particularly in our state court system. One of the things that judges consider when setting a person's bail or conditions of release is that person's employment status. And so if you're not employed, what we found out is that you have a higher chance of being incarcerated pre-trial. And so you can see how unemployment among Black people in Louisiana actually leads to mass incarceration of Black people. And, one of the things that I love so much about racial justice litigation and advocacy is, we have the ability to kind of make those connections, right? Because I don't think that it's always so visible to see that in considering a person's employment status, you're actually having a negative impact on a certain community. But people who actually do litigation with a racial justice lens, or they do advocacy with a racial justice lens, can point out those connections. So that's just one thing. And I think on another level, and this is very similar to what Eliana said, again, Louisiana is so poor, that means that a lot of people in my state cannot afford lawyers. And so they have to face this system on their own. And so one of the things about our legal system, of course, is that it's very difficult to understand if you don't have formal training or experience. And so one of the things that I'm also passionate about is making sure that people understand how our system works. They understand what laws mean, what their rights are. And essentially, I like to think of myself as a translator. I translate laws and ordinances and I put them in plain speak for people. And that knowledge can be really empowering. And you don't have to have a law license to do that. You can start doing that now as law students, working on making the system more accessible for folks.
Thank you all so much. I feel like, especially going again in terms of the time that we're living in today with COVID-19 and the coronavirus, it's truly important that communities of color, especially Black and brown communities, are aware of how they are being impacted, especially economically, through the times that we're living in. You all provided very on point answers, and especially going back to how the community work is driven within litigation. And like you said, Anaya, and how you're a translator, you're being able to translate legalese to everyday people. And I feel like that's such a very important tool to have, especially as a racial justice lawyer. Along that lens, this passion of racial justice litigation, how do you think, and we're going to start off with Eliana, how do you think your career as a law school student helped you, prolong and bolster that passion throughout your day-to-day life as a law student?
Yeah, I think that it was about the organizations and the groups that I involved in that really helped bolster that. I think I knew going into law school that my purpose was to find tools to contribute to Black liberation. I knew that the law was not the tool to it, but like one of many tools in our toolbox. And so it was a means to an end for me. So I think associating with other people who had a similar mindset, I was heavily involved in our like public interest department at the school, our Gillis Long program. And so also the place where the funding exists, so not a bad place to hang out, to, so you can know when opportunities are coming your way. And those relationships exist beyond law school. Currently in my equal justice works, I was honestly just kind of calling to complain about like, I have so much, like a lot going on. We kind of need some help, and the director's like, send me a job description. We can, get you an intern or something. So just maintaining those relationships, I think is key once you're finding them with people who are on the same wavelength as you. I was heavily involved in our BOLSA as well. One year I was the social committee chair, so that gave me an opportunity to, host our parties and events, for lack of better words. So having the opportunity to network with judges and alumni who were inviting to like our, holiday functions. And then I think the big thing I was involved in was clinic. I knew that I really wanted the practical experience to see what I was interested in doing beyond law school. And I think that clinics and internships are great opportunities to do that and to really learn what you're good at, what you're not so great at, what you enjoy. Like Anaya was saying, in terms of just the skill of being able to translate the law and democratize it is really a skill that folks don't realize is like a skill set. And I think that my first internship after my first year in a community organizing it wasn't even a legal organization. They had lawyers on staff, but it was a community organization in New Orleans. And just really seeing that like, oh, okay, I'm good at this, at creating public resources, and this is important for community. So I think those are a couple of the like avenues that I pursue to bolster my commitment.
Yeah, I would just echo Eliana when it comes to clinics and internships in general. One thing, so I knew I wanted to go to law school to be a civil rights attorney, but I didn't have any attorneys in my family, like I'm sure many of you know. And so I really didn't have a really good understanding of what, attorneys really, but civil rights attorneys specifically did on a day-to-day basis. And so I was able to, get a couple of opportunities with civil rights organizations during law school that really kind of helped me understand how litigation intensive civil rights work can be. And I think that was really invaluable. The same thing with clinics. While I was in law school, I worked with our criminal defense clinic and got a chance to represent, indigent clients there. And it really just helped out and has been really beneficial to me in my career now as I'm focused on, mostly trial work. And so I would just kind of echo what Eliana said, that, you can really get a feel for what type of work you're going to be doing through internships and clinics. And especially if you're interested in civil rights litigation, the more work that you have in litigation is going to be really crucial going forward.
Yeah, so I did a lot of things when I was in law school, probably more racial justice work than actual coursework, but don't tell anybody I said that. I was president of my NLG chapter, and we held a lot of safe spaces for Black students to just kind of come and talk about what their law school experience was doing to them, and how, quite frankly, troubling it was at times. We also did educational forums on race and a lot of other things that I'm sure annoyed my administration. Here at EJW, like I said, I was also on the National Advisory Committee for 2 years. And the first time I went to an HAW conference, it was actually me and some other Black law students. And we were just kind of talking about how expensive it was for us to actually get to the conference, you know, back when you could actually see people in person. So when we were planning the next year's conference, I mentioned that conversation. And from there, that's how the diversity scholarships were born. And so that's a little bit about me. But I think the bottom line is that I kind of made those opportunities happen because, like Eliana said, I found my community. You know, Ella Baker, who's one of my sheroes, she always would ask people this question, you know, who are your people? And in law school, you have to find your people. So whether that means joining a student org or starting a student org, joining community groups or doing clinic. I actually worked on fair housing issues like Jason did, but probably not as well as Jason does. You know, whether that means speaking truth to power, you just have to find the courage to do it, even if you're alone.
Thank you so much. And just to add a few thoughts to that, myself in particular, I just graduated from law school this past May. And one thing I would say about my law school career was I wanted to shake things up. Like I came in with the mentality that my law school had this certain perspective, and I think it had like a certain stigma outside looking in. And I just wanted to come in and just like bring in speakers that wouldn't quote unquote travel to, like, I went to Notre Dame, so South Bend, Indiana, and wanted to allow more students of color to be attracted to go to the law school, and students of color to be, quite frankly, comfortable in the space. A lot of law students, a lot of students of color, when they come to places like South Bend, they feel uncomfortable. They feel like, are they here? Should they be here? And just to have events like Anaya say that will welcome community, finding ways to like promote like racial justice issues. One of the events that I remember that I helped to host was bringing in Anthony Ray Hinton of the Equal Justice Initiative to campus and having a discussion of how important it is to abolish the death penalty, or having events where we brought in Carmen Perez Jordan, who was one of the co-founders of the March on Washington for Women. Having those types of events, because you have to be able to, like, you know, shake things up when it comes to racial justice issues. I would say that each and every one of you, especially law students that are participating in this conference, do not be afraid to, like, you know, speak out. Do not be afraid to utilize your voice, because you have a certain passion, and don't shy away. Like, there's a reason why you were accepted to law school. There's a reason why you're there, and make sure to utilize your resources and feel free to, like, you know, to be different and, like, you know, basically shake things up. Our last question before we go to question and answer, as each and every one of us, we were law students before, and, like, you know, this is a question that's constantly asked throughout conferences and career panels like this. When you were in law school, and or specifically, what advice would you give future racial justice litigators and community organizers in terms of not only making it through like their last years of law school, but also finding opportunities like each one of you were able to find post law school?
I think one important thing is to, especially right now, I think it's really easy to attend like trainings and activities that fit the framework of what your ethos represents. So, you know, organizations like Law for Black Lives, they'll have a lot of trainings that are centered on movement lawyering and through a Black feminist framework. And if that's the framework that you envision doing your work out of, I think going to those events, meeting people there back when it goes to these events being in person. I think another thing is maintaining your relationships with your peers. And it's not that you're best of friends with every single person, but the folks who you realize, you know, even if we're not best friends, like we are on the same path, we have the same ethos, like I get along with them, we work well together. Maintain those relationships, because those are the people who are gonna, you know, equally be popping up at the same events and know about these opportunities, and you guys will be sharing those with each other. Yeah, so those are the two initial things that come to mind.
I think, to me, if I could go back and tell myself something, my last year would be to just stay the course. You know, all of us went to law school for a particular reason. You know, especially us that are public interest minded, racial justice minded, there was something in your community that affected you and inspired you to go and invest the 3 years to go to law school. And when you get there, you know, there's going to be a lot of different opportunities. And you know, while you're in law school, I always tell people that it's good to kind of get a diverse array of experiences so you know exactly what you want to do once you're out there practicing. But when it comes to racial justice work, you know, if it's something that you really want to do and you want to make a career out of it, I think that it's important that you just stay the course and remember why you came. And you know, kind of like Walter mentioned, you know, a lot of these opportunities are few and far between. And sometimes, you know, you might have to wait a little while before you get an opportunity to do this work full time if that's what you want to do. But you know, it's also important to remember that you can do a lot. You know, even if it's not you know, a full time gig, even if it's something that you do pro bono at a law firm, even if it's something that you do in your spare time, advocate for an issue that you really care about in your community. So whatever it is, if you even if it's not something that you want to do full time, or you can't get a full time position, even if you really want it, just know that you can still affect change and make a difference, regardless of where you're at.
Yeah, this is a really great question. So I think first off, I'd congratulate anyone who's graduating in the middle of a global pandemic. But like a couple things. So first, I think I'd ask people to think about what this system means and what it is. So for some of you, the legal system might represent justice, a way to make things right. But for some of us, we see it as another tool of the powerful, a system that's oppressed and hurt people. You know, after all, they call it law school. They don't call it justice school. And so I think as an attorney, you can either reinforce that oppression that communities of color have experienced for so long, or you can try and use this imperfect system to build power for Black people in communities of color. Another thing I'd say is to be careful of how you measure wins, right? So, you know, plain and simple, racial justice litigation is not going to always result in court victories. You know, I also can't tell you how many times I've written bills that ultimately like don't even make it out of committee. You know, so you have to really be creative and think about what are some other ways that you can measure success when you're doing this work. Another thing I'd say is that everything you learned in law school was probably devoid of context in history. Even though you may have learned that the law is objective, the law actually has very real material consequences for Black people and people of color. And especially if you belong to multiple marginalized communities. So say, for example, you're a Black trans woman or a Black person with a disability. And it's been that way for a really long time. So try and learn that context and that history, and don't expect others to teach it to you. And recognize that this is going to be a lifetime study. And I think as far as finding opportunities, you know, I guess my response to that, I'm more concerned with how people show up in these spaces when they get here, if that makes any sense. So, you know, if you're starting out doing racial justice work, I think you have to be open to this idea of learning. You know, one of the first things that like law students and attorneys who've gone through anti-oppression say to me is like, oh my gosh, like, am I a terrible person? And I'm like, well, no, like you're probably not, but you know, you're learning something new and that's uncomfortable, but like lean into that and welcome that, because it really paves the way for you to build authentic relationships. And it's going to take time to build relationships with folks, especially if you don't come from the community that you're trying to work with. You know, people might be suspicious of you when you first show up. And all that means is that you have to just demonstrate trust. And there's no shortcuts with that. You just have to keep showing up and being consistent. And so the final thing I'll add is, you know, to not be a savior. You know, one of the things that we've all kind of mentioned during this panel is that communities tend to have a pretty good idea of what they need. And it's up to us to figure out how to support that as attorneys and legal professionals. And so if people are looking to you because they think you have all the answers, then that should signal to you that you're probably taking up too much space and you're not working in a very collaborative way. So those are just a couple thoughts that I have.
One final thing on just surviving law school and even post-law school is don't let it consume you. I know that it becomes very easy to let like the competitive nature and the oppressive and elitist nature of law school consume us to a point that it takes away, honestly, from our happiness and our healthiness. So I think that one thing is, you know, having that separation of, you know, work-life balance once you do graduate and while you're in school, you know, creating community outside of law school or folks from law school who you have community with outside of law school and it's not based solely in the construct of law school.
Yeah, just to add my 2 cents on that, what Eliana just said, I would say it's very important to find a way so that law school doesn't consume you. I can even find myself, having just graduated this past May, finding ways to, like, you know, finish the semester, finishing during a pandemic, and finding ways to be like, okay, I'm about to graduate, but also I have a life as well too, and I need to be able to make sure that I'm able to, you know, translate that into, you know, starting off this new career and being able to balance a work and also social life. Also too, I would say when I was a law student, one thing that I wish I did even better was finding ways to build relationships with mentors, especially mentors of color. Especially in this space, the type of work that we do, I feel is truly important to find the person that you can connect with, that has been through the rigors of law school, who has been through like the job hunt, who has been there in the office dealing with these microaggressions that a lot of young lawyers, Black and brown lawyers, and other lawyers of color face in these spaces. I feel like it's truly important to talk to a person who's been through this experience, so you're able to like relate to that person. During my first internship experience, I was able to have a mentor at the organization that I interned with. Ironically, was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I truly believe I would not be able to like have made it through law school or even potentially not be afraid and not, you know that I deserve to be in to have such opportunities that I had if it wasn't for that mentor, because a lot of us don't have lawyers in our families. A lot of us who don't come from a place where you have someone that you can look up to, we tend to like, you know, take a step back. We tend to not want to like, you know, take a chance on the type of work that we want to do. So I feel like it's truly important to have someone that you can connect with, both both professionally and a person who can tell you that it's okay to take a break from doing the work. Well, thank you all so much. I feel like now we're going to jump into the Q&A section. I believe one of the staff members is going to help us out.
Hello, we have a few questions. The first question is, what was everyone's plan on how to self-heal and not give too much of yourself away in the opportunities that you've been given? And if you need me to repeat it, just let me know.
I think one thing, I was strict on boundaries. I think realized going into it, having clear expectation of what the commitment is, and then creating boundaries outside of that. For example, like while in law school, if we were like done studying and done with everything else and we were just hanging out, I wasn't trying to talk about, school or class or get that intertwined with, my social life. Similarly, sometimes I do realize like I need to work late or I need to work weekends, and I, walking in with that expectation. But if my expectation is I'm gonna be done at this time, After that, I'm not taking calls, even if it's urgent, because all of my clients' needs are urgent, because that's the population I've extended myself to. So I think setting those boundaries is important because you're dealing with a heavy line of work. So everything is going to seem important and urgent because it is, but you can only give to this work if you have something to give. So you have to reserve your energy.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, everything that Eliana just said, definitely having boundaries put in place. This system is really, really big. And unfortunately, there's only a couple of us that are doing this work. And so if we want to be intentional with how we respond, with how we support our communities and actually work for justice, we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. That is, I think, another part of my job requirement is to take care of myself. And so however you cope, whatever that looks like for you, whatever brings you joy, you should absolutely try and build that into your work week.
Yeah, I would just echo what Eliana and Anaya said. Self-care is super important, especially, we're not only dealing with an era where racial justice is kind of elevated in the consciousness of society at large, and just that trauma alone is enough to deal with. But then on top of that, you're dealing with the pandemic, and many of us, are in self-quarantine. We're in our houses all the time, and it's really hard to set those boundaries when you work where you live. And so, yeah, I would just echo what they said. Find something that you can do to take your mind off of the stressors. Read a book, watch trash TV. Really find a group of folks that you can lean on. I think also it's important to give yourself some grace. We're all dealing with a lot right now, especially Black and Brown people and other communities of color, and us who are doing the work. It's really hard. And like Anaya said, there's very few of us who are doing the work. And the reality is that we might not be able to help everyone that we want to help. And so that's really hard to deal with sometimes when you can't help someone. And I think it's just important to remind yourself that, you're a human. You only have so much that you can bear. And to just give yourself some grace and do what you can.
I would say, just to echo that, self-care is really important. One thing that I relied on, especially going through my last semester last year, during the pandemic, having made the quick transition at the time when I was going through remote learning, and also keep in the back of my mind that I would not have a virtual I would have a virtual graduation, and also too having being one of the law school graduates to have taken the bar exam during this time, remotely especially. I felt like if it wasn't for self-care, there were a lot of days where I would struggle, because I'm like, wow, everything is hitting me at once. And so I had to find ways to escape, had to find ways to keep myself enthused, because you would have, especially being a Black or Brown person, in terms of not only, facing racial injustice on a personal level on a day-to-day basis, but also having to be able to, transition and help communities from Black and Brown communities and other communities of color in the work that we do. So you have to make sure that you're the person that's doing that work. So you have to take care of you. And that's one thing in particular that I constantly told myself as I made it through the past few months of taking the bar exam, transitioning to a new role and moving to a new location. You have to make sure that you're the person that, that's in this role. You're the person that's in law school. You're the person that's going through these things, but you have to make sure that there's times where you have to give yourself boundaries from talking about law, or talking about stuff that relates to your job, and finding ways to escape so you can wake up the next day and have a smile on your face, so you can wake up the next day and have a, fresh of breath air. And so, anything that you can do that, you know, helps you escape, I would truly, truly encourage.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, how can attorneys like you and law students committed to this work utilize COVID as a catalyst in racial justice work? Also, how can Black communities prepare for future disasters such as COVID?
That's a really good one. I think, you know, a good starting point is recognizing that this pandemic was not a coincidence. You know, and our response and the racial disparities that you see in recovery rates and rates of infection, that is in part due to systemic inequities that Black communities and communities of color have been experiencing for a long, long time. And, you know, those inequities span multiple areas, right? It spans from housing to, you know, here in New Orleans, where half of the homeless population is Black. It spans to our criminal legal system and how we disproportionately lock Black and brown people up, not only in government-run institutions, but privately run institutions and immigration detention centers. And of course, that's translating to COVID-19, you know, making these institutions essentially be tinderboxes. It also spans to economic justice, of course, you know, because insurance is tied to people's employment status. A lot of people, unfortunately, are not getting the care that they need to recover from this disease. And so I think, you know, as we explore this question together, I think that really coming to terms with the fact that this pandemic has been made worse because we have not really invested and supported communities of color in a compassionate way, in the way that we should. I think that's an essential starting point.
I guess in agreement with what Anaya is saying, I think part of using it as a catalyst to racial justice is creating visibility of the injustice, as Anaya just described. I think another thing is to lean on our resources and developing information that we have. So as we're translating meetings into Zooms and these other platforms, make sure that your folks who you think need to the supported community also have access to these new evolving forms of communications and forms of getting knowledge and information, because knowledge is power. So I think, yeah, just leaning in on community and creating visibility as to the issue will allow you to use COVID and other disasters as a catalyst to propel your cause. Now, I was going to ask if either Jason or Anaya, if you had any input on the future disasters. I think you guys are equipped to look at future preparedment.
I think in terms of future disasters, I think that going forward, a lot of the pain that was caused by COVID, you know, can be addressed in part by, you know, again, addressing some of the economic inequities that were really exposed during COVID. So a great example would be, you know, the eviction crisis that we're dealing with right now. Even before the pandemic, you know, communities of color, especially Black people, were disproportionately affected by evictions. And in part, that was because we didn't address the previous housing crisis, where a lot of Black and brown people lost their homes in the foreclosure crisis because of predatory lending. So all of this is really kind of built up to where we are today. And I think that, you know, if we're gonna move forward and we're gonna be in a position where there's less disparities in how people are affected by these types of disasters, we really have to get at the root cause, which is, you know, in and of itself, it really boils down to poverty, but also just especially making sure that people are in a position where they're in more secure housing. I think there was a report last week that said that, you know, if we implemented, you know, or expanded the Section 8 housing voucher program, we could cut poverty in half in America. So, you know, I think that, you know, going forward, we definitely have to, you know, take a look at some of these inequities that were exposed and made worse by the pandemic. And, you know, hopefully the next time something like this comes up, you know, Black and brown folks won't be as disproportionately affected as they were this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any recovery that we have, it has to be created using an equity and racial justice lens. You know, like Jason pointed out with the housing crisis that we're in the middle of right now, I think for me, what's been especially stark is, you know, on one hand, seeing folks be, you know, evicted and having their belongings thrown out in the street. And then on the other hand, seeing folks buy like their second or third house. And, you know, this like very stark divide is just really appalling. You know, that's kind of the only word I can think of. And so it just kind of shows you that during this pandemic, people who are already hurting are going to continue to be hurting, and people who are already doing well are going to succeed even more probably. And the only way to really think about how to lessen that divide or to, you know, hopefully close it is by using an equity lens and also finding ways that other people can be involved in this work. You know, Jason talked a little bit about the eviction crisis. You know, one of the things that I'm personally passionate about is, you know, kind of training up everyday people so that they can advocate for themselves or for their neighbors in housing court and in those types of administrative hearings. And so I think on one hand, it's having an equitable recovery plan. And then on the other hand, it's thinking of ways to create multiple entry points for people who may not have a law license, but still have so much expertise and wisdom to give.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
All right, our last question is, are there any things that you are reading or listening to that inform your work that we too should be investing time to study?
I'll start us off. Right now, I'm finishing up Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which is a really good book that you know, discusses the caste systems in India and Nazi Germany and how you know they you know correspond with the you know the current racial caste system that we have in our country. That's the most recent book that I've been reading. In general, I just, you know, I do a lot of podcasts from the New York Times Daily Coast, which is a good one as well, just to kind of, you know, keep me abreast of what's going on in terms of racial justice. Also, Pod Save the People is another podcast I listen to regularly.
Yeah, I actually keep a stack of books on my desk that deal with race and equality in the law. That's why I was like looking around to see where some of them were. So this is, I think, a really good starting text. It's called A Perilous Path, and it was written by Sherilyn Ifill, Loretta Lynch, Brian Stevenson, and it's just like amazing. So I think that's a really good starter text for anyone who's kind of coming into this work for the first time. And this, I think, is a really good, I guess, like intermediate text From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. It was written by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who's a history professor at Princeton. There's also The Miner's Canary, which is a book that I reread at least once a year. And I just am a personal fan of Ella Baker, and Barbara Ramsey wrote a biography of her a couple decades ago. So those are some books that I turn to when I just need to be grounded again. So I hope those are helpful for y'all.
I'll let the academics answer because y'all got it. I think that the only book that is like truly at like the base of my collection is the new Jim Crow. Beyond that, I think that I consume my information in other ways, more so than reading at home, though I wish I had more time to read.
I would say for me, one book that I didn't have a chance to read during law school, but I'm reading right now is The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. So Anthony Ray Hinton, who was, Brian Stevenson's of the Equal Justice Initiative's a client. So I was able to build a relationship with Mr. Hinton when I brought him to Notre Dame to come and speak. But that's such a phenomenal book, and it's unique because it's coming from a perspective of a person that was wrongfully convicted and that was on death row in the state of Alabama. So I highly encourage you all to read that book as well. I also guess that our session is over. I want to once again thank each and every panelist. This was a phenomenal opportunity to moderate this discussion. I believe it's truly important that we had the opportunity to, share the intersection between community work and racial justice. To all you law students and also law school professionals, thank you for taking this Saturday early afternoon or early morning, wherever you at, to come and listen to us, and we truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to all of our panelists for participating in today's session. We hope everyone enjoyed it. The recording of this session will be made available for everyone to listen to later today. You can still access the recording by coming back to this page on Pathable. Attendees will have access to this recording for a year after the fair ends. And we also want to thank our conference sponsors, the National Association for Law Placement and LexisNexis, for helping making this 2020 conference and career fair possible. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.